We severely underestimate the intelligence of people in the past. We think that since we have iPhones, we're inherently more rational, moral, and intelligent. However, the truth is that we just have more stuff. You get some crazy examples like the 11th century monk who flew 600 feet by glider, the ancient Greek astronomical computer, or how Archimedes used an enormous mirror to magnify the sun's rays to burn ships in the 3rd century BC. We sort of have this belief that the first steam power was around 1800, and that sparked the Industrial Revolution. In fact, the first steam power came in about ancient Egypt, who used steam power around 2000 BC to operate pistons that would open the doors to Pharaoh's court, and the first steam engine was built in the modern world in 1551 in Turkey as a mechanism to turn spits for cooking meat. However, the big invention a lot of you have probably heard of is Hero of Alexandria's invention of the steam engine in the 1st century AD. A lot of alternate historians use this as the point of departure to say that the ancient Greeks, or Eastern Greek half of the Roman Empire by this point, could have industrialized. This is technically true, but ignores all the cultural and economic factors that allow industrialization. However, if the Greeks had the technology to industrialize and built a social structure earlier that allowed it, we could have seen an industrial revolution 2,000 years before our world. How would this have affected history? What would the effects on demographics, culture, borders, religion, and war be like? That is the question of this alternate history. By the time Hero showed up, Greek civilization faced two issues when it came to industrialization. One was the intellectual/cultural, the other economic. Interestingly, the two or three were linked and could have been changed with a single shift that had taken place 5 centuries before. The economic issue that the Mediterranean faced around the birth of Christ was the predominance of slavery. Industrialization, or the investment in machines over human labor, only makes sense in systems where human labor is expensive enough that spending capital on a machine to replace it is a worthwhile investment. One of the reasons in our timeline that China never industrialized in the 19th century was due to a population boom that agriculture couldn't keep up with, and thus human labor was super cheap. In Hellenic or Greek Egypt where Hero lived, that was definitely the case. The Egyptian state was basically socialist, and the central government could draft Egyptian peasants to work on whatever they wanted to. Similarly, the large slave owners that dominated the society weren't interested in increases in individual productivity, since their social advantage was based upon the sheer number of workers, and thus increasing individual productivity would erase their advantage compared to smaller, better-run farms. I once read a really interesting book that went through about 6 different well-known ways to increase agricultural productivity that the classical world just ignored, since they had no interest in improving individual productivity. For these reasons, Hero used his steam engine for toys rather than applying it for anything economically useful. Historically, this sort of logic was the biggest thing that prevented industrialization. Similarly, intellectually and socially, Hellenic or Greek civilization was not ready for an industrial revolution. Greek culture looked down on mercantile affairs, viewing them as beneath the honor and dignity of a gentleman. A really interesting thing was that in Athens, where the upper classes depended a great deal on their livelihoods upon the stock market, if you want to call it that, and trading, they would use slaves to do the managing for them and accrue all the benefits, but would claim it was the slaves' doings, not theirs. This was not a society ready for modern capitalism. Finally, Greek civilization did not believe in the scientific method. They believed that abstract forms govern the world, and that what we happened to see was just incidental to the great truths of the world. Logic was superior to experiments in the real world. This is why people believed that the heavier object fell faster than the lighter one for 2,000 years, even though a brief 30-second experiment would have proven this principle wrong. This did 2 things. Firstly, it prevented scientific analysis of actual events, and it prevented application of said scientific principles to society, since the relationship between logic and technology was divorced. What if I told you that these issues preventing Greek civilization from industrializing are connected, and removing one of them would get rid of the rest? Hellenic civilization made a conscious choice around 400 BC to go down a path to never move to a higher technological level. Our tale starts in Athens, a mercantile colonial empire that relied on foreign trade to sustain it. It was a democracy and thus filled with internal competition. There were generally two camps, one sustained by the aristocrats and believing in the traditional ways, and one led by the nouveau riche mercantile interests. As capitalism took over the society and Athens became more susceptible to the free market, the aristocrats saw their traditional economic and social dominance decay. Their wealth and power was based off landowning and the traditional social norms of deference. Meanwhile, the mercantile influence was based off the colonial empire and trade, and were social relativists who believed that culture wasn't inherent. This is where Plato comes in. I apologize to all my philosophy fans here, but I'm about to take a dump on your favorite man, Plato. In my opinion at least, the whole trajectory of Western philosophy has been based off bullshit inferences. Plato and Socrates, to a lesser extent, were supporters of the traditional aristocracies. They believed that values were inherent, and thus the traditional ones that gave the aristocracy deference were inherently true. Similarly, Plato's beliefs in the immutable forms, of which the physical world was merely a weak imitation. If the world was made up of immutable forms, it could never change, and that would be a great world to the aristocracy. Similarly, all of Plato's other arguments are statements for the aristocratic system in one way or another. In the end, aristocracy and Plato won. Sparta, an anti-capitalist and aristocratic state, if any existed, beat Athens in the Peloponnesian War, thus snuffing out democracy, social change, and free thinking. It was replaced by Macedonia and a slew of other monarchical states until the end of Greek civilization. Similarly, Plato was widely seen as a genius and became the founder of Western philosophy as we know it. The idea of Platonic forms was very popular and even had a pseudo-religious following before the scientific revolution proved it wrong. With the aristocrats in charge, believing rational but not accurate beliefs, the slave-owning model replaced the capitalist one in the classical world. In both Greek and Roman civilization this was the case. Both had very advanced economies, but the capitalist classes held little power. So, in this timeline, Socrates is never born. Socrates was the original philosophic proponent of the aristocratic viewpoints, and he was a genius, and his example inspired Plato into philosophy, and thus without him, we would remove two geniuses from the aristocratic cause. This would mean the sophists, or the people supported by the mercantile classes and who believed values were inherently relative, would become dominant in societal debate. It goes without saying that Western philosophy would be completely different in this world. There's this saying in philosophy circles that the whole history of Western philosophy has been commenting on stuff Plato said. And that means that in this timeline you can basically just scratch off any Western philosopher you've heard of out of existence. Similarly, Athens wins the Peloponnesian War and crushes Sparta. This could have easily been done if Athens had won the Syracusan campaign to defeat Sparta's most powerful ally, Syracuse, in Sicily. The Athenians nearly won this campaign and only lost since their leadership royally fucked up. With even moderately functional leadership, the Athenians would have won this battle. This would in turn have given them control over the incredibly wealthy eastern half of the island of Sicily, which would have in turn have given them incredible strength to win the war. Without the flower of Athenian youth killed at Syracuse as it was in our timeline, the Athenians are gradually able to encircle and strangle Sparta. Athens is left the master of Greece, in a manner similar to the way Sparta was in our timeline. In our timeline, the Thebans were able to crush Sparta after the Peloponnesian War, since Sparta was tired from the war. With the war ending far earlier and with Athens' much greater population and wealth, Athens would be able to maintain its dominance. Similarly, without the power vacuum, Macedon would be unable to unite Greece earlier, with Alexander and his family remaining marcher lords in northern Greece and unable to wield all of Greece as a weapon against Persia. The sophist mercantile classes were also those who were most aggressive and violent in Athenian society, wishing to form a colonial empire. Thus, Athens would have continued expansion in this timeline, waging war against Persia for the coast of what is today Turkey, alongside Cyprus and the Greek states in Italy. Capitalist societies have interesting relationships with slavery. In general, the expansion of capitalism results in greater freedom in the capitalist heartlands, and servitude in the peripheries that supply said heartlands with goods. You saw this earlier in the expansion of capitalism in Western Europe, and northeastern North America resulted in expanding freedoms, such as the French, British, and American revolutions, but the creation of slave societies in the New World and serfdom in Eastern Europe to supply them with goods. Similarly, the enormous explosion of capitalism after World War II resulted in the spread of equity to women and ethnic minorities, but your iPhone also supports authoritarian regimes in China and Vietnam alongside Congolese warlords. Thus, we would see slavery decline in the Greek heartlands themselves, but in the regions that supplied Greece with resources, namely areas like Ukraine and Egypt, bondage would flourish. However, a free labor economic system would give Greek civilization much greater potential. Similarly, when the Greeks followed a school of philosophy that prioritized the study of the outside world rather than abstract forms, they did achieve great things. The main school of philosophy that proposed this, the Milesians, were able to figure out evolution, atom theory, the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun, scientific laws, and that all life comes from the sun. A Greek civilization that prioritized free labor and the scientific method would have done great things. In our timeline, Western civilization developed a free market economic model and an observational belief of the universe around 1300 AD. Industrialization occurred around 1800 or 500 years later. There's no way to know exactly, but this indicates that it would take several centuries to move on to an industrial level of civilization. In our timeline, Hero invented the steam engine around the birth of Christ, but with a more mechanical worldview, the Greeks would likely have been able to invent it several centuries earlier. In between, we would see Greek civilization become richer, freer, more populous, and more technologically advanced in a variety of ways, similarly to the progress seen in Western civilization between 1300 and 1800. As Greece would become more powerful economically and the Persian Empire would likely decay due to the ruling class becoming too immersed in harem politics, the Greeks would likely detach Egypt, with which they had much trade and would turn into an economic dependency. Similar processes would likely take place in the Levantine shores and Anatolia, all of which would be sucked into Greek economic imperialism. Without the military genius of Alexander and the great military made by Philip of Macedon, the Greeks would have been unable to fully conquer the Persian Empire. It seems at least plausible that the Greeks would use their economic position in Egypt to project trade into the Indian Ocean as they did in our timeline, spreading trade tendrils to India. In the Western Mediterranean, the Greeks would use their colonies in Italy to expand across the whole peninsula, strangling early Rome in its cradle. They would conquer much of peninsular Italy, meeting up with their colony of Marseille in France. The first industrial invention that would be implemented in a large scale and of real importance would be the steam engine on the boat. Greece is a jagged peninsula, and the Greeks were people who hugged the sea everywhere, with boats as their main form of transportation. The railroad might have limited application in small regions, but due to geography and the small population sizes involved, would be much more limited. Greeks likely build railroads for other states, however, the Persians likely paying a pretty sum for Greek mechanics to build railroads to connect their vast empire. Similarly, improved technology and mechanization would allow Greek manufacturing to become dominant, with Greek-produced goods becoming cheaper, thus expanding Greek economic power enormously. If anyone would be able to keep up or even surpass the Greeks, it would be Carthage. Carthage was a merchant republic and was like the light version of the later European colonial empires. Carthage was an advanced capitalist economy and large trade network, and without a smothering priest class, would be able to keep abreast of developments in Greece, becoming a large competitor in the Western Mediterranean and using its advanced technology to gain control of Spain and the Maghreb. The Persian Empire would likely have had greater trouble developing their economy and industry further. Firstly, the Persian aristocracy were nomadic horse tribes, who disdained trade and commerce, viewing it as dishonest. Similarly, the Mesopotamian priest elite held up development in that region for thousands of years due to various social controls. The Persian Empire would likely gradually fall behind Carthage and Greece, similarly to the Ottomans in our timeline. As proximity to an industrial timeline would weaken Persia's traditional social structures, the Mesopotamians would rebel against the Persian overlords and the empire would disintegrate. It seems plausible the Greeks would take over Mesopotamia in the power vacuum that would follow to gain another route to India. We run into an interesting issue with gunpowder. In alternate history, we often run into issues over whether certain inventions were fated to happen or not. I see no reason why gunpowder would have been invented in this world. Gunpowder is super counterintuitive, and one couldn't have expected people to have naturally found it, since the way before it that weapons got better was you improve the quality of the metal. And the Chinese invented gunpowder since Taoism believes that certain potions can be made to find the elixir of immortality. And thus China was chemically experimenting for said elixir for more than 1,000 years before they discovered gunpowder, which makes it seem unlikely the Greeks would have in this world. An interesting irony we get here is that gunpowder was the only thing that gave civilization an edge, or explosion, so to speak, over the barbarians. Before its widespread usage, tiny groups of barbarians like the Afghans or Mongols were able to conquer huge and advanced civilizations. So without gunpowder, the technologically and economically advanced kingdoms like Carthage and Greece would hold no military advantage over the barbarians. Similarly, without the Romans, who were a bizarre aberration in history with this, they would not have developed drill and mobile formations that gave the Romans such an unbelievable military advantage over their opponents. So before we continue, I'd like to make clear that the stuff I'm about to talk about, I'm pretty sure it would happen, but at the same time I have no idea of the order or the timescale we're talking about, or even what century these would happen in. The first thing is that it seems likely the Celts would eventually conquer the Greeks. The Celts were consistently able to beat the Greeks in combat, and even smashed through much of Greece and modern Turkey in our timeline. As a centralized Athenian empire would start to decay over the centuries and fall to corruption, as has occurred to all empires, it seems likely the Celts would take over their former Greek empire. The Celtic conquerors of southern Europe would eventually transport Greek civilization north to their brethren in northern Europe. Western civilization would be based off the synthesis of Greek and Celtic civilization, rather than the Roman and Germanic it was in our timeline. Without Roman interference, and with Greek influence from Marseille, Gaul, or modern France, would become a centralized state to prevent the Germans from taking over Western Europe. The Germans would in turn be culturally influenced by this Greco-Celtic civilization, and as nomadic invaders like our timelines, Huns, Avars, or Magyars, would push them west, might result in Germanic invasions of Western and Southern Europe, only to be assimilated by the natives like they were in our timeline, and combined with the Celts and the Greeks to form a pan-European civilization. The Celtic invasion of Southern Europe would likely slow down economic progress outside of North Africa. Southern Europe would enter into a dark age. However, remember in our timeline, the barbarian kingdoms that came out of the Roman Empire were in fact far more inventive than the Roman Empire itself, even during the Middle Ages, due to their internal competition. We might expect the Celts to be able to, over several centuries, pull themselves out of the Dark Age and continue the Greek technological innovations. Carthage, with the Mediterranean and excellent navy as a shield, would be spared these invasions. This would become Carthage's golden age. As naval technology would improve, the Carthaginians, already incredible sailors in our world, would exploit it unbelievably. In our timeline, the Carthaginians circumnavigated Africa and sailed to Britain regularly. A reasonable argument is even made they reached the New World. With more advanced ships, the Carthaginians could achieve great things. It seems likely that they would have discovered the New World, and with roughly the same plagues as the conquistadors, alongside iron weapons and horses, would still be able to conquer the native peoples of Central America. In this case, the Mayans and Toltecs rather than the Aztecs. It seems at least plausible, with control of the seas from the seizure of Panama, that the Carthaginians would have conquered the coastal-based Moche and Nazca cultures of Peru, like our timeline Spaniards. Likewise, the Carthaginians would have made their route rounding Africa more regularly, rather than just a one-time thing, securing a colony in South Africa at the temperate halfway mark to trade with India. With the Carthaginians in control of the Straits of Gibraltar, it would have prevented the Greeks from expanding into the Indian Ocean. However, the Celtic states of Gaul and Britain would have had no problem with this, and could have easily become colonial powers. Similarly, it seems plausible the Carthaginians would try to reconquer their homeland in Lebanon for partially emotional reasons, but also as a way of getting a trade route into Central Asia and the Indian Ocean, given how hugely strategic this region is. There's no bloody point in even guessing religions. Religion is a reflection of the society it's in, and thus, with so much technological progress, things would be very different. In this era, people were still developing the modern traditional religions like Christianity, Confucianism, Buddhism, and the like to deal with the new world of huge empires and cities, but with an industrial revolution centuries earlier and enormous geographic exploration, things would get much more complicated. Hell, in our timeline, we spent the last 150 years trying to figure out what the dominant ideology or religion would be for industrial-era civilization, and we still don't have a good answer. However, for this timeline, the dominant religions would almost certainly not be Christianity, Buddhism, or Islam, which never would have existed. If I had to put a bet on anything, I'm guessing sun worship, considering the Milesian philosophers believed that the sun was the originator of everything, and the sun is so universal that it would be easy to build a religion off it. What if altist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for more content. Alternatively, check out my Patreon that's got the first 2 chapters of my history of the world posted, as well as all sorts of cool maps and other content. And also, I'm hosting a Q&A live stream session at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this Sunday, so please check it out and ask me some questions. As always, thank you very much and have a great day.